Are you curious about what became of the 9 children of James Brown? The man the world knew as the Godfather of Soul, behind the sharp suits, electrifying performances, and relentless drive that transformed him into one of the most influential figures in music history. There was a family story that few ever truly saw. A story of brilliance and conflict, of fame's legacy passed down through bloodlines that carried both the rhythm and the weight of his name. James Brown was more than a performer. He was a force of nature. From a dirt-poor boy in South Carolina to an international icon, his rise was a testament to ambition without limits. His voice powered the civil rights movement. His beats laid the foundation for funk hip-hop and modern pop. But while he built an empire on stage, off stage, he struggled to maintain peace in the family empire he created. Over his lifetime, Brown fathered 9 recognized children, each born into a whirlwind of fame, discipline, and expectation. To the public, he was a man of unstoppable energy. To his children, he was a complex figure, part hero, part storm. Some followed his path into music, carrying his rhythm into new generations. Others turned away, choosing quiet lives, far from the spotlight. Together they form a mosaic of triumphs, tragedies, and tangled inheritances. From his eldest daughter, Yamma, who carried his business torch, to his sons Teddy and James Joseph Jr., whose journeys reflected both the glory and the pain of being a Brown. This is not just the story of a family, it's the echo of a dynasty built on soul. Let's begin with number 9, the youngest of the Brown legacy, and move backward through time to uncover how the children of James Brown have lived lost and carried the fire that he left behind. Number 9. James Joseph Brown II was born in 2001, the youngest of all James Brown's 9 children and the only child from his marriage to backup singer Tommy Ray Heine. His arrival came late in the Godfather of Soul's life, when James Brown was already in his late 60s and standing at the summit of a legendary, complicated career. By then, Brown had nothing left to prove to the world, but he was still a man consumed by rhythm drive and a constant need to control his legacy. For young James II, that legacy was both a birthright and a burden. He spent his earliest years in a world far removed from the poverty that had shaped his father's youth. His home was filled with gold records, velvet stage suits, and echoes of music history. Yet the household was far from peaceful. Even near the end of his life, James Brown's world was marked by legal battles, financial disputes, and public controversies that would only intensify after his death in 2006. For his son, childhood was a mixture of privilege and confusion, being the center of his father's pride while growing up amid constant noise. James Brown adored his youngest child. Friends recall how the Godfather softened when little James II was around, proudly introducing him at events and even bringing him on stage during performances in the early 2000s. He called him Little Man and saw in him a second chance to be the kind of father he'd never had the time or the peace to be with his older children. But fate gave them little time together. When James Brown died suddenly on Christmas Day 2006, his son was only 5 years old. In the years that followed, James Joseph Brown II found himself at the center of one of the most chaotic inheritance battles in entertainment history. Questions about his parents' legal marriage and his legitimacy as an heir created a storm that would drag on for over a decade. His mother, Tommy Ray Heine, fought publicly to secure his place in the Brown estate, insisting that her son was the rightful last child of the legend. Now, in his 20s, James Joseph Brown II has lived a life both touched and haunted by the legend of his father. He has occasionally appeared in documentaries and public tributes, often quiet and reserved, carrying the face and charisma that unmistakably mark him as James Brown's son. Though he has not pursued music professionally, at least not yet, those close to him say he has inherited his father's rhythm and confidence. As the youngest of the Brown dynasty, James Joseph stands at the crossroads of inheritance and identity, growing into a world that still reverberates with the sound of his father's voice. For him, the beat began long before he was born, and it has never truly stopped. Number 8. Teddy Brown was one of James Brown's eldest sons, born in 1954, during the years when the Godfather of Soul was still clawing his way out of obscurity. Long before James Brown was a household name, he was a struggling musician, traveling from juke joint to juke joint across the South, carrying his dreams and his young family in tow. Teddy grew up not in the glow of fame, but in its making, watching his father build something from nothing. One show, one song, one scream at a time. As a boy, Teddy saw the earliest version of James Brown, the driven, fiery performer who refused to accept limits. He inherited that same determination and quickly became known within the family as his father's shadow. When James began dominating the airwaves in the 1960s, Teddy was often by his side, traveling on tour buses and spending time backstage during rehearsals. The two shared a strong bond rooted in respect, ambition, and a shared belief in discipline. By the late 1960s, as Brown's fame soared to new heights with hits like I Got You, I Feel Good, and Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, Teddy began developing musical ambitions of his own. He joined his father's touring ensemble, occasionally performing percussion and working behind the scenes. Those who knew him said he had his father's energy and his mother's warmth, a natural charm that lit up every room. James Brown was proud of him, seeing Teddy as both a reflection of his youth and a continuation of his fire. But the story of Teddy Brown would end in heartbreak. In 1973, while driving near their Georgia home, Teddy was killed in a tragic car accident. He was only 19 years old. The loss devastated James Brown, who was known for his emotional toughness, but wept openly at his son's funeral. Friends said it was one of the few times the indestructible Godfather of Soul seemed truly broken. After Teddy's death, James Brown dedicated several performances to him, including renditions of Please, 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 one of his earliest hits, sung with an ache that audiences could feel in every note. He never spoke publicly about the pain, but those closest to him said it haunted him for the rest of his life. Teddy had been more than just a son. He was a mirror of everything James had fought for and everything he stood to lose. In the Brown family story, Teddy represents the cost of success, the reminder that behind every legend are private tragedies unseen by the crowd. His death marked a turning point for James Brown, deepening both his spirituality and his obsession with legacy. Though gone too soon, Teddy's presence lingers in the soul and sorrow that defined his father's later years. Number 7. Terry Brown was one of James Brown's lesser-known children. Born during a period when the Godfather of Soul's fame was spreading across America like wildfire. By the early 1960s, James was not only dominating the stage, but redefining what it meant to be an entertainer. Tireless, commanding, and in complete control. Yet as his professional empire expanded, his personal life grew more complicated. Terry was born into that world of power and chaos, a family orbiting around a man who was both loving and impossible to contain. Unlike some of his siblings, Terry grew up largely outside the glare of the spotlight. His mother was not one of James's wives, but a longtime companion, and their relationship existed in the blurred lines that surrounded the singer's life during his busiest years. Though not raised directly under the same roof, Terry remained close to the Brown family circle and spent portions of his youth visiting his father's properties in Georgia and South Carolina. James Brown, known for his strict sense of discipline and relentless work ethic, expected excellence from everyone around him, including his children. He often told them that nothing in life would ever be given, only earned. Terry absorbed that lesson early. Those who knew him describe him as quiet, but determined, someone who admired his father's success, but understood the cost it came with. As an adult, Terry chose to live a grounded life far from the tumult of fame. He worked in Georgia and maintained a low public profile, occasionally appearing at family events and tributes to his father. While he did not pursue a career in music, he remained proud of his roots, often expressing admiration for his father's unmatched impact on Black culture and global entertainment. After James Brown's death in 2006, Terry found himself, like many of his siblings, pulled into the legal disputes over the estate. A tangled fight that stretched for years, dividing the family and drawing media attention. Through it all, Terry maintained his distance from the spotlight, speaking only occasionally to affirm his respect for his father's legacy and his desire to see it preserved with dignity. Today, Terry Brown represents the quieter branch of the Brown dynasty, a son who carries his father's drive without the need for applause. He embodies the lesson James Brown tried to teach all his children, that greatness isn't measured by fame, but by how one stands when the music stops. Number 6. Deanna Brown. Thomas was born in 1969 to James Brown and Deidre Jenkins during one of the most dynamic periods of her father's career. The late 1960s were the years when James Brown was not just a musician, he was a movement. His anthems like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud became the soundtrack of the civil rights era, and his influence reached far beyond the stage. But for Deanna, growing up as James Brown's daughter meant living in the eye of that hurricane where fame, activism, and discipline collided every day. Deanna was raised in the world. Her father built grand estates, rehearsal rooms, and a constant parade of musicians, politicians, and preachers. To the outside world, James Brown was untouchable. To his daughter, he was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. She once recalled that her father demanded perfection in everything from table manners to schoolwork. He didn't want us to just be his children, she said. He wanted us to be examples. Even as a child, Deanna showed a sharp mind and a sense of purpose. She traveled with her father on tours, learning early about his work ethic, his showmanship, and the contradictions that came with being Mr. Dynamite. When James and Deidre's marriage ended in the early 1980s, Deanna remained close to both parents. But it was her father's influence that shaped her destiny most deeply. As an adult, Deanna carved her own path, not as a singer, but as a businesswoman, broadcaster, and philanthropist. She became president of the James Brown Family Foundation, dedicated to preserving her father's musical legacy and continuing his tradition of giving back to the community. She also launched the James Brown Academy of Music Pupils, a program that provides arts education to underprivileged youth, teaching not only music, but discipline, the very lesson her father drilled into her as a child. Deanna has emerged as the voice of responsibility within the Brown family. While others became entangled in legal battles over the estate, she is focused on unity and purpose, ensuring that the world remembers the man beyond the scandals. Through public speaking, community work, and interviews, she embodies the best of both her father's worlds, his showmanship and his compassion. Now, in her 50s, Deanna Brown Thomas continues to champion her father's message of empowerment and excellence. My father wasn't perfect, she once said, but he taught us to stand tall and never stop moving forward. In those words lies her inheritance, not the wealth or fame of James Brown, but his unbreakable will. Number 5. Yamma Brown was born in 1972, the younger daughter of James Brown and Deidre Jenkins. By the time she entered the world, her father was already a legend, a man whose name defined funk and whose influence stretched across the globe. Yet for Yamma, the experience of being James Brown's daughter was as complicated as it was extraordinary. She grew up in a world where discipline, expectation, and contradiction were constant companions. Her earliest memories of her father were of strength and spectacle, the godlike performer who commanded audiences with a flick of his wrist. But at home, the power he wielded on stage sometimes transformed into control. Yamma later revealed that her childhood was marked by both privilege and pain. She witnessed the darker side of fame, the volatility, the temper, and the fear that came with being raised by a man who demanded absolute respect. Still, she loved him deeply. "My daddy was my hero," she said. "He was also the man who scared me the most." Despite the turbulence, Yamma inherited her father's intelligence and drive. She pursued higher education, earning a degree in business and pharmacy, and for a time worked in the healthcare field. Yet she could never fully escape the gravitational pull of her family's legacy. After her father's death, she stepped forward as one of the most candid voices in the Brown family, determined to tell the truth about what it meant to grow up in the shadow of a genius. In 2014, she published her memoir, Cold Sweat, My Father James Brown and Me, a raw emotional account that peeled back the myth to reveal the man. In its pages, Yamma described a household ruled by perfectionism and fear, but also one filled with love and lessons that would stay with her forever. She wrote not out of anger, but out of understanding, the kind that only comes with time and forgiveness. Today, Yamma is a public speaker and advocate for domestic violence awareness, using her family's story to inspire others to break cycles of abuse and find healing. She remains one of the few of Brown's children to speak openly about their father, not to destroy his image, but to humanize it. "He was complicated," she once said, "but he taught me how to survive anything." Through Yamma, the world sees James Brown not only as the Godfather of Soul, but as a man who, for all his flaws, raised daughters strong enough to turn pain into power. Her life is proof that the Brown legacy is not only musical, it is deeply human. Number 4. Venisha Brown was born in 1964 to James Brown and Yvonne Fair, a talented soul singer who once performed with the Chantels and later toured with the James Brown Review. From the beginning, Venisha's life was touched by both music and turbulence. She grew up surrounded by the power and intensity of her father's world, a man whose very presence could fill a room and whose name carried both admiration and controversy. Unlike some of her siblings, Venisha inherited not only her father's charisma, but also his fiery spirit. She was strong-willed, outspoken, and fiercely loyal to the Brown name. Though her relationship with James was at times complicated, she adored him, and he saw in her a spark that reminded him of himself in his younger days. Proud, passionate, and unpredictable. Venisha's early years were spent moving between her mother's care and her father's orbit of fame. The life of a James Brown child was never stable, constant touring new faces, and a patriarch who demanded excellence even at home. Despite this, Venisha grew into a woman with her own sense of purpose. She didn't chase the spotlight, but she never ran from her heritage either. In adulthood, Venisha worked closely with the James Brown Family Foundation, supporting community projects and youth outreach programs that reflected her father's lifelong commitment to education and empowerment. She was often seen at public events honoring his legacy, smiling, energetic, and proudly representing the Brown family's next generation. Those who met her described her as warm and candid, someone who could move from laughter to intensity in an instant, much like her father did on stage. But Venisha's life was not without struggle. She faced her own battles with health and personal challenges over the years. Yet even through hardship, she remained a devoted advocate for keeping her father's name associated with strength and inspiration rather than scandal. Tragically, in September 2018, Venisha Brown passed away from complications related to pneumonia at the age of 53. Her death was another devastating blow to a family already marked by loss. The James Brown Family Foundation issued a statement, remembering her as one who embodied the spirit of her father. Tina Brown Thomas, her half-sister, called her our firecracker, full of soul and love. In many ways, Venisha represented the raw, unfiltered energy that made James Brown immortal. She lived life on her own terms, boldly, fiercely, without apology. Through her activism and personality, she ensured that the Brown name remained tied not just to fame, but to family, community, and resilience. Number 3. Larry Brown was born in the early 1960s during a time when James Brown's career was rising at a speed few artists had ever experienced. The Godfather of Soul was reinventing popular music, transforming rhythm and blues into something new, something unstoppable. Amid this revolution, his personal life was a whirlwind of relationships, travel, and relentless work. Larry entered the world at the intersection of fame and exhaustion. A son born to a father who was rewriting the rules of sound while struggling to master the rhythms of family. Very little about Larry's early years has been made public, and that's by design. James Brown was a man who guarded his private life with the same ferocity he brought to the stage. He demanded loyalty and control, and the people around him rarely contradicted his wishes. Larry grew up in the periphery of fame, rarely photographed, and even less discussed in the media. Yet within the Brown family, he was known as one of the most even-tempered of the children, gentle, practical, and quietly observant. While his siblings were drawn toward music or public life, Larry pursued stability. He stayed close to his extended family in Georgia and South Carolina, living away from the spotlight that had both elevated and consumed his father. James Brown provided for him, ensuring that his children never lacked security. But Larry chose independence over luxury. He worked in business and local enterprises, carving out a modest life, defined more by peace than ambition. After James Brown's death in 2006, Larry emerged briefly in the news during the drawn-out legal battles over the estate, though he kept his comments minimal. When reporters sought sensational stories, Larry remained measured and respectful, reminding people that despite the chaos surrounding his father's legacy, he was still just Dad. His calm demeanor and refusal to engage in drama made him one of the more grounded figures in a family often defined by intensity. Friends and relatives say Larry carries his father's best qualities, his work ethic, his pride, and his sense of dignity, but without the volatility that so often accompanied them. He may not have inherited the microphone or the stage, but he inherited the moral rhythm that kept James Brown moving forward against every obstacle. Today, Larry Brown lives quietly, away from cameras and interviews, maintaining the same distance his father once craved but could never achieve. In his restraint, he represents a different kind of strength, the choice to live simply to honor legacy through steadiness rather than spectacle. Number 2. Darryl Brown was born in 1963, during the years when James Brown's reign over popular music had become absolute. The Godfather of Soul was touring the world, redefining performance itself with his razor-sharp choreography, thunderous bands, and unmatched energy. To the world, James Brown was invincible. To his son Daryl, he was both larger than life and nearly impossible to reach. Growing up, Daryl was surrounded by music. The family home in Augusta, Georgia was never silent, horns rehearsing, drummers pounding backup, singers harmonizing. His father demanded perfection not only from his band, but from everyone around him, including his children. He was tough, Daryl once said in an interview. But he wanted us to be better. He didn't want us to depend on his name. As he grew older, Daryl developed an ear for rhythm and melody that was unmistakably inherited. He joined his father's touring entourage as a teenager, learning the inner workings of the James Brown Band from the ground up. He played guitar, wrote songs, and soaked up his father's professionalism and precision. While other children might have been crushed by such high expectations, Daryl thrived under them. He wanted not just to honor his father's music, but to understand it, its mechanics, its pulse, its soul. In the decades following, Daryl established himself as a respected musician and producer. He played guitar for his father for many years, helping to arrange and perform songs during Brown's later tours. After James Brown's death in 2006, Daryl became one of the few children actively working to preserve his father's musical archive. He has appeared in documentaries, written songs inspired by their relationship, and spoken publicly about the responsibility of being the son of soul. In 2014, Daryl published his memoir, Inside the Godfather, offering an unfiltered view of life with his father, a man both adored and feared. The book paints James Brown not as a saint or villain, but as a deeply human force, brilliant, complex, and demanding. Daryl's account resonated with readers for its honesty and its rare glimpse into the private world of an artist who never slowed down long enough to be fully known. Now in his 60s, Daryl continues to play music and mentor younger artists. He often says his greatest inheritance wasn't fame or money. It was the work ethic that defined James Brown's life. "My father's gift to me," he once said, "was that he showed me what commitment looks like. You don't quit. You get up. You go to work." Daryl's story captures the heartbeat of the Brown dynasty, a son who didn't run from the shadow of greatness, but learned to stand inside it with pride, humility, and rhythm. Number 1. James Joseph Brown Jr. often called JJ, was born in 1951, the first son of the man who would soon change the sound of American music forever. At the time, James Brown was still a young dreamer, with a hustler's drive, moving between gospel shows and rhythm and blues gigs, trying to break through. JJ was born into a life that had not yet tasted fame. But his father's hunger for success was already a constant pulse in the household. As a boy, JJ saw his father's transformation from a struggling performer to a phenomenon. By the time he reached his teenage years, James Brown was headlining theaters across the country, commanding audiences, and building an empire that demanded every ounce of his attention. JJ grew up at the intersection of two worlds: the working-class struggle that defined his father's early life, and the glimmering promise of stardom that quickly surrounded him. He inherited his father's ear for music and his restless ambition. In his 20s, JJ began performing with his father's band, working in production and experimenting with funk and soul grooves of his own. He was close to his father, but also aware of the man's complexity, his brilliance and volatility, his generosity and unpredictability. He loved hard and expected everything. JJ once told a journalist, "When you were around him, you either rose to his level or you fell behind." JJ lived through the most dramatic years of James Brown's life. The peak of the 1960s, the civil rights activism, the wild 1970s, and the turbulent 1980s, when the Godfather's fame clashed with his demons. Yet, through it all, JJ remained loyal. When his father was arrested, hospitalized, or vilified, JJ stood beside him. When James Brown's career revived in the 1990s, he was there again, helping coordinate shows and supporting the Brown family legacy. After his father's death in 2006, JJ became a quiet, stabilizing force in the family. While lawsuits, estate battles, and controversy engulfed the press, JJ avoided the spotlight, working behind the scenes to protect his father's music and the dignity of his name. To this day, he is respected among his siblings as the steady hand, the one who carries his father's discipline without his rage. Now in his 70s, James Joseph Brown Jr. remains deeply private. But his influence can be felt in the way the Brown family has slowly reclaimed control of their narrative. He represents the bridge between the man and the myth. The one who saw James Brown rise, fall, and rise again, and live to tell what it really meant to be the first son of soul. Across 9 children, the story of James Brown's family reads like an echo of his own life. Brilliant, chaotic, disciplined, and endlessly resilient. From Daryl's devotion to music, Deanna's leadership and community work, and Yamma's courage to tell the truth, to Venisha's fire, Larry's peace, and the younger James II's inheritance of charisma, each of them carries a fragment of the rhythm that made their father immortal. James Brown was never a simple man. He was a paradox disciplinarian, an innovator father, and taskmaster, savior, and sinner. His children grew up inside that contradiction, learning that greatness comes with both gift and cost. Some embraced his legacy, others distanced themselves from it. But all of them, in their own way, continued his story. Even now, decades after his final encore, the pulse of James Brown's life still beats through the voices, choices, and memories of his 9 children. Together they form not just the next generation of a musical dynasty, but the living proof that soul is more than a sound, it's survival.